Communication conducted on Tuesday, May 19th, 2020. The roll call reflect that all board members are present, except, I believe, for Board Member Bernard. Is that correct? In addition,
that is correct.
In addition to our directors who will be presenting budget items this evening, we have our Superintendent Darren Vanderheiden, our Recording Secretary Tina Vorlicek, and our Director of Business and Finance Becky Bohl. And normally I would stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, but because I have so many wires connected to my laptop this evening, I'm just going to remain seated. So if you would please just keep your microphone muted and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And since we are conducting this meeting by teleconference, just a few reminders and announcements. Please keep your microphone muted, refrain from using the chat feature, unmute your microphone to speak, and then remute the microphone when you're done. All voting will be conducted by roll call vote in alphabetical order, including our newest member, Dr. Pullman. And this meeting is being recorded and will be available on the ISD 423 website tomorrow. And that should be available on the home page. It should be fairly obvious under school board meetings and videos, and you could just click to that page. This meeting is also being live streamed on HCVN, also available on the ISD 423 homepage. You should be able to look under the school board meeting news item for Tuesday, May 19th, and then click on live stream to watch that in real time. So I don't believe we received any public comment. Just a reminder for members of the public, if you have some comments that you'd like the board to hear, please submit those by email to the address on the screen, and you need to do that in advance of the meeting by at least 2 hours, and then include your name and your address and identify the agenda item that you are addressing, and we'll be happy to read those aloud at the public comments section at the beginning of the meeting. And our agenda item this evening is the 2020-2021 preliminary budget presentation. And I'd like to introduce our Director of Business and Finance once again, Becky Bohl.
Thank you, Chair Kamrath. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2021 preliminary budget hearing for the upcoming school year. As you know, as a school district in the state of Minnesota, we have to have a budget adopted by June 30th of every year. So we do our preliminary hearing typically in April or May, and then we have our final reading in June so that we can meet the statutory requirement to have a budget in place on July 1. So on the screen before you is our agenda, and we're going to talk about the building blocks of our school district budget, the key assumptions you're going to hear from each administrator and budget manager. And at the end, we'll talk about what it all rolls up to as far as fund balance, fund by fund summaries. There will be time for question and answer. And one thing I wanted to make sure I mention before we get started is I may move rather quickly at the beginning of the presentation, simply because these slides are intended to be standalone, such that if you are not attending the meeting or streaming it live, they stand alone and you'd be able to follow along with respect to what our process is for budgeting. So I just wanted to mention that before we get started. Next slide. The district used modified zero-based budgeting philosophy, and in its simplest form and definition, that means that we start at zero each year. We build our budget up fresh from the ground each year, and then the first step then in that process, there's many steps, but the first step is to take a look at what our revenue is expected to do in the upcoming year. How is it expected to change relative to the current year? We take a look at the state formula funding, we look at enrollment, etc. Then Superintendent Vanderheiden and I consult with Finance Committee, and we make a recommendation to our administrative team whether we're going to increase expenses, decrease, or keep them the same. Next slide. We do run a decentralized model. Modified zero-based budgeting is highly decentralized. Each unit manager is one of our administrators. They review their operational budget, and then they can also make what are called level 2 and level 3 requests. Level 2 requests would change programs or move dollars around, but it doesn't add any new incremental dollars to the spending for that department. Level 3 requests, they were going to be offered at a scaled back level this year, but that decision was reversed once we knew what the COVID pandemic meant for the state of Minnesota and our local community. What level 3 requests are is incremental dollars that would be approved, and it would add programs, it would add supplies or equipment to the budget. Next slide, please. Another major part of our budgeting process is to hold team personnel meetings and capital outlay meetings. What we do, the superintendent's cabinet first meets to allocate out dollars amongst curriculum, technology, equipment, and facilities. Capital outlay dollars total approximately $700,000 to $800,000 a year, depending on student enrollment. It has a levy and an aid component. Once we have some big picture allocations and targets figured out, we meet as a larger administrative team and we conduct a work session in order to narrow down a list of many, many needs all across the district to priorities that we can all agree to support going into the next school year. On a per pupil basis, capital is approximately $230 each. Modified zero-based budgeting is no different than any other budget that you would have in a household or in a private business or any public business. It's a spending plan. It's assembled as of March 12th, what I knew at 3:05 p.m. And that really matters in today's operating environment, our economy and society. We're going to continue to review information as it comes available to us, and we'll update and communicate our spending plan. So for now, the electronic copy and links to this presentation and all of the supporting documentation is as of March 12th. And then what is happening in our times right now is continually we are receiving additional guidance from the Department of Ed at the state and national level. And just, a day and a half after I rolled it up, we received summer school guidance on May 14th. So I just want everybody to be reminded that this budget is built on assumptions, and those assumptions are as good as what we know on May 12th for now. So with the next slide then, we will continue to monitor our budget and make updates and bring budget amendments and recommendations forward to the school board on an as needed basis. Tonight, you're going to hear from each member of our administrative team. They're going to present their portion of the operating budget. They'll speak to major line item changes if they've reallocated dollars. They'll let you know the rationale for that, how that's important to student achievement. They will also recommend any personnel changes. We are not conducting any planned reductions at this time. Nor are we adding dollars to the budget. We need to know more about what our next set of executive orders and legislative requirements are going to be. It will be important for each administrator to go over the student achievement impacts of their recommendations, and then the board will have a chance to take in this information, and then if you have questions, you can reach out to Superintendent Vanderheiden, myself, or any one of the administrators that you'll hear from this evening. So then just, again, the school finance disclaimer is going to show up frequently throughout the presentation, and it will be stated verbally even more frequently than it is built into the presentation. And that simply reflects, as I mentioned before, the times that we're living in. This is a plan, and plans change, and they are going to change relatively quickly. So then when we get back to the steps of the budget, we're taking a look at enrollment frequently. We look at it monthly, sometimes more than once a month, and then we also pay really careful attention each time that we submit our MARS student records to the state throughout the year. So when we take a look at our revenue, 80% of it is comprised of state aid. And the main drivers of it are enrollment, like I mentioned, and then the per pupil formula allowance, and we'll get to the second one in a minute. What I wanted to mention was that we were semi-optimistic when we were talking last year at this time with respect to enrollment, because at the end of calendar year 2018, the county was reporting an increase of almost 10% in births, 393 versus 2017's 257. Now, the good news is that we haven't gone backwards when we reflect on 2019 numbers, but the 2019 numbers look more similar to 2017. So 2018 will model and be careful to increase revenue, hopefully, if the capture rate maintains its current level, which it has done. I don't expect that to change. We'll model in that increased revenue in 2023, but then you will not see that extend out into 2024 based on the birth data that I've obtained as of this month. So, as I mentioned, per pupil formula allowance is what's applied to those student enrollment numbers. And what we've been seeing as a district over time on the next slide is that our enrollment has fallen from an enrollment just shy of 3,000 back in 2007 to 2,826 in 2019. So those lower birth rates do have a significant impact on our operations, and that's not unique to Hutchinson. That's reflective of demographic shifts and trends all across the state and the nation. So as you can see on the slide, prior to applying the per pupil formula amount, we take a look at what our existing cohort sizes are, and then we advance them based on grade progressions. How many students do we capture as we move from one school year into the next? And as you can see, the second revision that I'm recommending for current year is a decline of 55 students, and this matches identical with the MAR submission that we completed towards the end of April. This is very, very different than how we ended the 2019 or most recent school year. Last year, we were up one student, as you can see on the slide. Previous to that, we had seen a decline of 31. And then if you kind of keep moving your way left, you can see that the year before that, it was an increase of 3. You know, when I see these numbers, I'm thinking, okay, 3, that's relatively flat. But then as you can see, in 15 and 16, we did have declines, which much more aligned with 2018. So then as we progress these students out into the next school year, we're projecting a 18 student decline at this time when we factor in kindergarten enrollment at 185. And then just for your reference, I have included the enrollment projections that I have in our long-range model at this time going out to 2025. So, you know, I mentioned that we used to have just less than 3,000 students, 2,962 to be exact. Had we kept those students, we would have almost $1 million more in revenue each year. But that's just not the society that we're in. So we have to work proactively as a district, and we'll continue to do that to make sure that our resources and our level of expenditures matches the revenues that we are expecting to take in. So then on the next slide, I had made reference earlier to another important driver of revenue, and that's the per pupil funding allowance. As you can see on the far right of your screen, we're anticipating a formula allowance of $6,567 per student. That is a 2% increase. The legislature has finished its business for now. They may come back for a special session, as many of you know, to address the ongoing public health emergency, but I don't expect them to make any changes for the 2% on the formula that we're expecting to see next year. So that was good. However, when we look further out, I am very, very concerned about 2022 and 2023 revenue. But in any case, you can see here the purpose of this chart is to show that, you know, had the formula allowance kept up with the pace of inflation, we'd be seeing $7,206. And I remember a time when I was presenting and we would say that that was the case for 10 years, but we're rounding the corner on that being the case for almost 20 years. And so that divergence is significant for school district operations. That's a 10% variance. And then if you apply that to our enrollment in any given year, that's between $1.5 and $2 million in revenue that we haven't had to keep up. Meanwhile, our expenses increase in any given year from 2 to 6 to sometimes 10%, depending on the expense category that you're looking at. Because of this fact, and the fact that our formula isn't, flagged, or it doesn't track along with inflation, the district really appreciates all of our federal and state revenues to the tune of 12% of our total budget. So then on the next slide, to sum up the revenue drivers, fewer students is less revenue, and a reduction in resources in order to make sure that we're aligning expenses with revenue. We will talk about all the details and then what that means in detail at the end, but I am anticipating a modest deficit spend of $500,000 for the next fiscal year. Again, I am concerned regarding the 2022 and 2023 revenue in light of the fact that during the Great Recession, we were seeing some economic indicators similar to what we've already seen on a very preliminary basis in the last month. And what happened to school districts at that time, many of you were a part of the organization, but for those that weren't, we saw 0% increases on the formula. So basically, when the federal stimulus dollars arrived back then, they called it ERA funds, the amount of federal stimulus, it really didn't give districts a boost because the state aid was offsetting and declining at the same amount or the same pace. So it was a wash. But nevertheless, we'll be proactive as a district to make sure that we are doing the best we can to align expenses with revenue, keeping in tune to what's happening with all of the various funding streams, and working towards long-term financial stability for the district. So then when we turn to the other side of the equation on the next slide, we see that our operating expense budget is anticipated to be almost $36 million during the 2021 school year. And as you can see, the majority of our budget is comprised of personnel costs. So it is really important that we examine staffing and try to ensure that we can provide the best possible programming for students while living within the means of the revenue funding streams that we are allotted both at the national, state, and local levels. So then I had alluded to a couple of key assumptions on the next slide during the revenue discussion, but just to call them out, the main drivers of our budget would be that we're factoring in a kindergarten enrollment of 185. Now, if we look back to pre-2015, we were seeing cohort sizes of 215 to 235, some 245s. But in recent years, we've been seeing 185 to 205. So that has also had a big impact, as I mentioned and explained earlier. And then, of course, we use the grade progression ratios for subsequent grade levels. We also take into account what non-public schools in the district are doing, and then also the PSEO options that our student has. Revenues, the 2% increase I had mentioned, and then when we go to the next slide, there's a couple of key assumptions that we have to remember when we're budgeting for a school. TRA is factored to phase in over 5 years, and we take the next step up with the employer share going to 8.13% from 7.92. There is aid to offset this, so we continue to factor in both sides of that equation. And then, as I mentioned before, we're living in a very different time, and with respect to the COVID pandemic that is going on, I don't have line items in our budget for fund transfers. But as many of you know, and we talked about during the most recent regular school board meeting, the governor has given school districts orders such that they can transfer funds across operating, food service, community ed. Typically in school finance, we keep those as very separate accounts. But what I'm trying to say is, we went through a voluntary and involuntary layoff process for fee-based programs on back of this COVID pandemic and the impacts that it's had on our programming. And that was a total of $225,000 reduction in expenditures. While I have carried that reduction forward into the next year, it's important to note that those expense reductions may very well shift among categories. We may not see the same exact positions impacted as we move forward and plan for the 2021 school year. So that expense reduction is factored in, but it's a big picture factor in at this time. And then when we get to the end of the fiscal year and we close our books and we determine how much we need to transfer across all of our funds, we'll take a look at what that means early winter for the various fund balances and savings accounts that we have for emergency and planning purposes. For example, in food service, we need to make sure that we have enough there and that they're not left in a really deep hole in case a very large piece of equipment fails unexpectedly. Some of their equipment costs as much as $30,000. So that's just an example of some of the transfers that we may be making out of the general fund in order to keep our programs across the entire district whole, given the environment that we've been navigating. The largest component of our budget I mentioned was salaries and benefits. And so all of the budget numbers that you're going to see include projections for unsettled contracts in accordance with the board budget for the various groups and individual contracts. But then when we do have a settled contract, we're using the exact amount reflected on the salary schedules in those agreements. So considering the time that we're living in, I added a slide specifically to COVID-19 so that everybody can see there's clear areas in our budget where we have gains and losses. And unfortunately, the losses are outpacing the gains and leaving some voids, as I had mentioned. The gains that we're seeing are sub-costs, extracurricular transportation, PD, utilities, and then the losses are with respect to some of the fee-based or utilization-based programs, third-party billing. We've also seen an increased need for hotspots for student connectivity to try to make sure that there's a level playing field out there for all of our students. We have purchased additional technology equipment that we weren't expecting, and there may be even more purchases in the future in light of, damage or repairs that are needed, additional wear and tear. And then two of the biggest areas that we've been putting attention on are the emergency childcare services that our early childhood staff and community education staff have really put together a nice program on very, very short notice. And the same with respect to food service. We switched from a regular school year model to a federal model almost overnight, within 2 business days. And so they are to be commended for the work that they've completed. They've switched gears on a dime, that's for sure. And then, of course, with any distance learning model, you would anticipate an increase in supplies and postage, and we have realized that. And so these are some assumptions that we wouldn't typically talk about, but I think are important that we keep our attention on the voids that some of these executive orders and legislative requirements are lending to with respect to our budget. So then as we move away from assumptions, I'm the unit manager for personnel, and so when I take a look at the requested amount, I recommend $26.7 million for the upcoming school year. And then you can see how that is allocated out across the various funds as well as the substitute budget. Now, these salaries aren't all inclusive because later in the presentation, you're going to hear Director Scott talk about ADSYS. Now, ADSYS does fall in the general fund, but it's its own program. It has its own specific goals. It has compliance with respect to the funding stream. So that piece is separated out and, for example, is not included in this $25.5 million that you're seeing up on the screen. So when you get to the bottom of your budget cover sheet that we sent out to the board, you will notice that at the bottom, the total is much, much more than what you're seeing on this slide, because that reflects all of the operating costs and then all of the personnel that fall in these other decision unit areas or departments. So with respect to that $26.7 million, that's a budgeted increase of 2.6% increase relative to how we expect fiscal year 2020 to turn out. So with that, we are going to transition into the part of the presentation where you will hear from each administrator regarding their operational costs and any leveled requests that they have. And I can pause there because that's a lot of assumptions and drivers and budget pieces. I think we'll just pause to see if there are questions on any of that, and then we can transition into our first administrator, which is Rob Daniker with the high school.
Becky, this is Joellen Kimball.
Yes.
I have a couple questions. You used the acronym TRA. If people are listening that don't know what that is, would you just briefly explain that? And then my other question is, will the childcare end when the school year ends?
Sure. So to answer the first question, TRA is the state pension system. It stands for Teacher Retirement Association. And so each educator, a percentage of their paycheck, 8.13% going into the next school year, is routed to that pension system as a district cost. But then there is also an employee share at 7.5%. And so we also send that deduction down on behalf of the employee. And then when the employee either leaves service or retires, they can draw from that pension according to their parameters. And they work directly with TRA on that. There is so many acronyms. I get so used to them, so I'm glad that you mentioned that so that I can outline that for folks. And then with respect to childcare, a summer program would fall underneath the community education umbrella. Right now, we do not have orders as a general fund per se to offer those emergency childcare services in the summer like we did during the school year. And so I do know that the community ed staff is reviewing the feasibility of that program. And then when they figure out how they're going to move forward with the various program pieces for the summer, they will let all of us know what that could look like if it's going to operate.
Becky, this is Keith. A few slides ago, you mentioned a 2% increase in the basic formula. Is that a realistic projection given the situation?
Yes, at the state level, I do believe it is. 2% increase on revenue, but of course, what we have to remember is that we're also factoring in student enrollment. So we need to apply that 2% increase, but then we also have to adjust our total state aid by that reduction of 18 pupils. And if you include categoricals, that's $9,500 a piece. So the reason I'm fairly confident in that 2% is if the legislature was going to make any changes, they would have done that over this past weekend when they were finalizing their state budget plans. Now, what the state could do at this point is start to borrow from us. And if they decide to use that tool out of their toolbox, what that does is it shifts aid metered to us. And if we were not in a good cash flow position, which our district is in a strong cash flow position, we'll be able to weather that. But some districts that are not in a strong cash position would need to borrow, go for a line of credit or issue aid anticipation certificates, which has significant costs associated with it. So to answer your question, I'm not as concerned about the 2% for this next year, years further out, because I do think that this pandemic is going to have lots of tails for a lot of years, 5 or 6 years probably. We are likely looking at 0% from the state in 22 and 23, and then I just wouldn't want to venture a guess any further out than that. But what I am concerned about for the upcoming year is if they're going to shift any of that aid. And so what that means for us here is not, obtaining any of those additional financing vehicles, but just ensuring that we have our funds invested in terming at the correct time. So we'll be watching that closely.
Thank you.
I would also just add that, just as a reminder for the community folks that are watching the meeting, that 2% increase, that was from last year's legislative session, and that's when they create the budget piece. So that 2% did not come from the current legislative session, but the one previous to.
Any other questions? I think you're good, Becky. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So then we'll transition over to our administrators and their piece of the program. We'll start with Rob Daniker from the high school.
Good evening, Chair Kamrath, members of the board. So tonight we're presenting the proposed high school budget for fiscal year 2021. The number is $217 $14,300, which is a match to our budget from fiscal year 2020. That also represents approximately a 2.5% decrease from fiscal year 2019. So we drew down requests is less this year and last year than we did 2 years previous. We do review those line items annually, and the purpose for that is to make sure that we're using money judiciously, also to make sure that we're not making unnecessary budget transfer requests. The largest request from a line item, the largest adjustment on a line item for the coming year was $1,500, which represents less than, it's approximately, I should say a little bit more than 1/2 of 1%. So we try to keep pretty close tabs on how we're spending and what we're spending on. Also included in the high school budget requests for this year is a level 2 request. You may remember last year we made a level 2 request to reduce a counseling position from 1.0 to 0.67 and allocate that remaining 1/3 to a Spanish position. That was due to an increase in interest in our world language programming, especially at our 9th grade. In the fiscal year 2019, we actually saw class sizes that were above what our target thresholds were of 32 at the high school. And so we made that adjustment for last year. And then we rectified that in planning for fiscal year 2021 by offering more elective opportunities for freshmen. And so we've seen the world language request decrease. Therefore, our level 2 request for the coming year is to restore that 1.0 counseling position. And so we would have 3.0 positions, full positions in counseling at the high school. And I'll take any questions the board might have.
Okay, we'll move next to our activities director, Thane Johnson.
Good evening, everyone. You can see the numbers there up on your screen. The activities budget for fiscal year 2021 is increasing, and the level 2 and level 3 requests reflect those. The level 2 request is the State High School League is increasing the fees that they charge schools in order to participate. So there's an increase there, and then they're also charging schools $1 per pupil enrolled. So the level 2 request is a reflection of the increase in both the activity fee that the State High School League charges us, and then also builds in that dollar charge per pupil. The level 3 request is to increase our athletic trainer services. That's a $5,000 increase there. And actually what we're going to do is we will take $5,000 and from general supplies. We had originally requested $5,000 in capital supply, and after talking to Becky, probably not the spot for that. So what we'll do is we'll take $5,000 from general supplies and shift that to our training services, and then the $5,000 that is in capital we will use for those general supply purposes.
Thanks, Thane. We'll go over to Jen with the ALC program.
Hi, good evening. The Crow River Area Learning Center is requesting to maintain the budget amount from 2020 to 2021. There is some small movement in one area from the academic contract to supplies and other salaries category, and that is so that we can better serve our most at-risk students. They're pretty basic here. Any questions?
Thanks, Jen. Now we'll head over to community education and hear from Director Moon.
Thanks, Becky. Dolph Moon, Director of Parks, Recreation, Community Education. Members of the school board, the community education budget for 2021 is estimated to be at $355,000, which is a increase over the 2020. The increases are mainly due to programmatic areas to cover expenses. And as the board's well aware, community education is managed through Fund 4, and we really end up driving a lot of our revenue from participation in our youth and adult enrichment, our middle level activities, and as people sign up for programs, we try to align with the expenditures that occur. Because we're enduring the pandemic, I think the upcoming school year is going to be rather interesting in that we'll need to make modifications as programs occur, and I'll be working closely with Becky to ensure that Community Ed manages their activities to the amount of revenue that's produced, which has a direct correlation to the expenses. If there's specific questions, they can entertain those from the board.
Thank you. We'll go over to Ann Baderius, who oversees our Early Childhood Family Education Program. This program is also a part of the Community Education Fund that Dolph was referencing, Fund 4, so it is a fee-based program.
Good evening. Before you is the program or the spending plan as it was written in March for this Fund 4 Community Ed program, ECFE, Early Childhood Family Education, which is programming for our district's children and families starting at after birth. So we have programming for infants, toddlers, along with parent education. This budget also includes early childhood screening that is also required by the state. We begin inviting children ages 3 to 3.5, and that screening, early childhood screening, needs to be completed before a child enters kindergarten. So this budget also includes that. This program is what we call a consumer-driven program, and so it is developed and designed each trimester. I guess we have a fall program, a winter, and a spring program based on the interest of families and signing up. You'll notice that the amount is a little bit different compared to last year, and that's due to just some programming changes. Our coordinator has been directly involved in covering some of the classes as a teacher and paraprofessional at times, so we were able to make some program adjustments. We have also been noticing a decrease in the number of classes that we've been able to offer that families have been interested in, mainly in the afternoons. As you can imagine, children and families from infants through age 5 or 4.5, most of their afternoons are spent napping and resting. So we're not able to offer as many programs in the afternoon. Any questions about ECFE, Early Childhood Family Education? The next budget that I'm presenting is for our Play and Learn preschool program, which also encompasses state school readiness funding. This also is what we call a Fund 4 program and coordinates with community education. This program is designed for children ages 3 through 5. We have programming for what we call 2-year out children, or 2 years out from kindergarten, and then we also provide programming for 1 year out children, so typically ages 4, their year prior to kindergarten. This program is funded through several what we call buckets of money. One is through Pathway 2 funding, scholarship funding. We have state and local, or state and levy dollars that also support it, as well as tuition that we collect from families And finally, this is a coordinated program with special education. It's an inclusion program. So we have co-teaching models available in all of our sections. In addition, this budget also covers the costs of our yearly Kindergarten Connection program, which is the summer programming that we provide to children prior to them entering kindergarten in the fall. So working right now to more than likely need to redesign that program from how we typically schedule it and offer to families, but hoping that we can still provide some prior experiences, meet or kind of get familiar with the building. And we're just not quite sure what that will look like yet. But this program, or this budget also covers the costs of that program. Questions about preschool?
Before Principal Verderius goes into her building operations budget, I do just want to point out again that you did just hear about 3 programs: community education, ECFE, and preschool, which all reside in community education. We call it Fund 4. There's all fee-based programs happening here. There are some aid and levy components that feed in there, but this is our best budget with what we know now. And you know, some may say, well, you know, it's going to be different. You know, why don't you try to factor that into your numbers? Well, yes, we all know it's going to be different, but we're still in the planning phase of what is going to be different. What are we going to be permitted to run for programs, those sorts of things. So that's why we're putting out our best set of numbers with what we know right now, and then we'll have adjustments as we work through the summer and fall.
Thank you, Becky. The next budget is for West Elementary. So this is the budget that provides the necessary funding to operate West Elementary, which is the district's kindergarten through 1st grade building. And it provides all of the instructional supplies and materials, curriculum supports, supplies needed to communicate with families, etc. And the amount is the same from the previous year.
Thank you, Ann. We'll head over to Park Elementary with Dan Oberg.
Hi there, this is Dan Oberg, principal at Park Elementary, our 2 through 5 building. This is the operating budget for next year. No real changes as far as the overall amount. This budget does operate our school, repair and maintenance, general supplies, instructional supplies, funds for art, music, technology, STEM, FIED, things like that. Helps maintain the media center, library, and some supporting programs with our counselors and our gifted and talented. So no real changes here for next year, the same amount that we've had the last couple of years. Any questions?
Thank you, Dan. We'll go over to Bill Carlson, assistant principal at the middle school. He oversees our ALC program there.
Good evening. This budget is the same as it was last year. It covers our supplies and material for our ALC Focus program. And there, like I said, there is no change.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Brenda Vathauer. She is our middle school principal. She'll talk about her operating budget next.
Thank you. Good evening. So our budget for the middle school echoes kind of what Park and West use their funds for. And for me this year, it was a new experience going through a year of learning how the budget process works here in Hutchinson. And the funds support the programming at the middle school. Again, the dollars are the same, but a little shift I made within the dollars, within the categories, is moving $500, not a lot, but a little bit, into just supporting some opportunities for students through the Southwest Service Co-op when they offer language arts or writing activities, some math type activities, having more opportunities for students to be involved with that when they have those. Keeping fingers crossed that they're still going to offer those next winter and spring.
Thanks, Brenda. Next, you're going to hear from our three principals with respect to the targeted services program that we run in grades 1 through 8.
At the middle school, we run targeted services in the AM and the PM during the school year. We have academic support for 45 minutes in the morning and for an hour after school, 4 days a week. And this also supports our summer program, which we run 12 days of summer school, obviously in the summer. Any questions?
So Park Elementary's budget is just a little bit bigger, I guess, when you compare it, but we do have more students that we do have summer school for. So again, this is a generated or a budget that's generated by attendance and those who would like or voluntarily come to our summer school. We service kids who we feel need that extra support in both reading and math, and then also some social skills that we do focus on as well. We run our summer school about 16 to 20 days out of the summer, and then we run starting in October, early morning, Tuesday, Thursday, before school program to support these kids as well. And that goes from October all the way through April.
West Elementary's Targeted Services Program supports children in kindergarten and first grade who have been identified at risk in either academic or that social behavioral area. We provide programming during the summer for students, as well as a before school program during the school year, running from the middle of October until about the middle of May, 3 mornings a week.
Thank you, Anne. Chair Camrath, would you like to take a 10-minute break, or would you like to keep moving forward with the presentation?
Your program is moving along pretty quickly. I guess unless there's some need to take a break by the rest of the board, I think if we keep moving ahead, we'll just get done 10 minutes earlier.
Okay, Karen Lehrfald with Nursing and Special Education Services.
All right, hello everybody. So for the nursing budget, this covers our staff development for the nurses and also nursing office supplies. So this budget is going to remain the same from last year. And then in special education, this covers a number of different areas: instructional supplies, professional development, contracted services, transportation, private duty nurses that we have for 2 different students within our district, Special Olympics, instructional technology for special education students, and assessment materials. So we are seeing an increase in the transportation costs for next year, a 3% increase, which is $19,300 increase. And then we're also seeing an increase in the private duty nurse of about $4,320. So that is where the increase is in the cost for special education. Throughout the budget, I did reallocate some funds. We have assessment materials that need to be updated for our special education evaluations. So we will need to purchase some new testing for that. So I have reallocated funds for that. And then also I've reallocated funds for paraprofessional professional development. That is an area that we've always seen a need for, and so we did reallocate some funds to be able to provide that throughout the year.
Okay, so Director Lehrfeld's special services budget is supported by quite an array of different funding streams, lots of buckets at play here. So we have federal funds coming in, totaling approximately $500,000 per year. We have state special ed funds that are reimbursed at approximately 55% on the dollar, 97 to 100% of transportation costs. And then we do also have cross-subsidy reduction aid for the second year in a row here as we move into 2021. After that point in time, the cap is lifting, so we're going to see some relief as a district with respect to some of the limitations to funding that the 2016 to 2019 formula had at play for us. And then there is some local funds, obviously, that go into this with the 50 cents on the dollar reimbursement rate, as well as some third-party pay revenue for our students who have medical assistance services that we can bill for. Okay, we'll go over to Dr. Scott.
Good evening, everybody. This is Mike Scott, the Director of Teaching and Learning for the district. The first slide that you see there is curriculum instruction and assessment. The main components of this budget support our 3 days of three and a half days at the beginning of the year of professional development when our staff is returning. It's the professional development opportunities that may arise during the course of the school year, if there's workshops or other bringing people into the district to support professional development. It pays salaries currently for PLC leaders, our mentorship program, our building leadership teams when we have department chairs. It also supports screening programs such as our FAST and STAR, which does our reading and math assessments, and curriculum writing time as well for our staff throughout the year. So that's the main components, and the number that you see there is built on our staff and our student enrollment, and that's where the fluctuation in our budget may come into play. The next slide is for our title programming. This is federal programming, and it's dependent on our free and reduced lunch status for Title I programming, and that is specifically supporting our students that may need extra support in reading and math, and we have title services K-5. Title II is we use those dollars for classroom reduction, so it helps support our teachers, some teacher salaries in terms of reducing some class sizes. Title III is for our English learners and support for that. And Title IV is a new non-title programming that we've been able to access, and that has categories for well-rounded education, safe and supportive schools, and technology. So in that whole application, there are a number of questions that need to be answered each year, and you see an increase there from last year to this year. This is always a preliminary budget. We anticipate getting the exact numbers from the Department of Education hopefully this week, but that usually changes as we see what our federal allocation will be. Right now, we do anticipate we're having carryover. Every year we can carry over dollars that we maybe don't spend, and each year we do have a slight carryover, and sometimes that is because of staffing changes, or if we don't hire a substitute, for example, for a certain day. So year after year, we do have some carryover dollars, so we are looking at using those carryover dollars next year, especially because of some lost one-on-one time we've had this year, that we may need to add some more time to some of our existing staff. So that's the plan at this time for our title program. And then the final slide, I know that Becky Bowl spoke about ADSIS. We had last year budgeted, so this is a 2-year application. We are approaching year 2 into the fiscal year 21. We fill that application out, and then it's locked in for 2 years in terms of what our programming is. So our programming from this current year into next year is not changing, even though you do see our dollar amount there is different. What we had budgeted for this current year was $647,000. During that time, we were going through budget reductions, and we, from what we had budgeted and presented last spring about these about the budget, what we had put into the ADSIS application. We had reduced a teacher for that. And so what we're requesting in this application and sent to MDE this week is $595,000, which is the same as what we had anticipated in programming expenses this year. So we're not reducing any programming than what we have this year. It's just more accurately depicting what we are going to be spending because we have a clearer understanding of what our assumptions are for next year. And I think those are the end of my 3 slides, and I'd take any questions if you have any. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is Becky Bowl. In addition to the personnel budget, I also oversee district-wide fixed costs and then the district office budget. What district-wide means is we have some contracts and grants, programs that we've pulled together underneath this umbrella. For example, Perkins, United Way, Pack for Families, and then the most important and the largest component of this is our school resource officer. And the increase of $10,000 is reflecting a return to the norm. Last year, when we were unsure about Safe Schools dollars and matching revenues with expenses with respect to the overall operating budget, the city was gracious and helped us out for a year. They reduced our contract by $10,000 without decreasing services. And so now that $10,000 increase is that reversion back to the norm. We do have one-time Safe Schools money to the tune of $90,000, which we will, it's a restricted classification of money, so it'll have its own little savings account on our balance sheet, and then we can continue to draw from that over the course of the next decade in order to maintain this level of service for our students and staff. Then on the next slide, when we turn our attention to fixed costs, I'm projecting an $8,000 increase with respect to our insurances, our phones, our severance costs for retiree health, and our unemployment. Those are some examples of the things that are underneath this umbrella. What's happening is we're seeing a decline in the expected retiree health insurance benefit costs, but then at the same time, we're expecting unemployment costs to increase and offset that decline to the tune of $8,000. So that's the explanation with respect to the fixed cost category. As we turn our attention to the next slide in district office, the overall budget has not changed relative to the current year, but I did shift dollars from supplies to travels and dues to reflect actual expenditures and spending patterns. So then next up, I'll introduce Director Moore. He will go over buildings, grounds, transportation, and then our long-term facility maintenance dollars that the district has.
Good evening, Dr. Kamrath, members of the board, members of the public. I'm Brian Moore, Director of Buildings, Grounds, and Student Transportation. The first slide that you see up there is plant operations. So this is a general fund that covers utilities, maintenance and repair, custodial supplies, and the like. This budget remains unchanged from the last few years. About 72% of this budget is accounted for in fixed costs, which are utilities and water and garbage disposal. The rest is discretionary for custodial supplies and maintenance supplies. There's no significant changes from years past. Moved a little bit of money around between utilities and into maintenance and repair. Last winter was a mild winter, and we came out really well on the fuel side. And then when the shutdown started happening this spring because of COVID-19, we really turned the buildings off. So this budget may require some changing next year, depending what our mode of operation is going into next year and what some of our costs are. Pending any questions, I'll have Rebecca move to the next slide. The next one is transportation costs. So this is regular student transportation, not special ed transportation. And this budget reflects pretty much contractual costs that we go through year to year. No significant changes, a little bit of a reduction. and some efficiencies that we've been able to work into it. And once again, next year, we don't know what the operating environment is going to be, so there may be some changes on how we accomplish transportation next year. Any questions? The last slide that I have is long-term facilities maintenance. Now, this is a capital budget account. This is not a general operating budget. So about 4 years ago, the state legislature enacted the long-term facilities maintenance program. This program is funded about 50% local tax revenue and 50% state aid. You'll see that this budget account amount goes up next fiscal year. The main big projects that we have going on that will be funded out of this are complete rebuild of the middle school front parking lot and the drive access to that. Some of the stadium renovations will be funded out of long-term facilities maintenance, and some of the costs associated with our birth through 5th grade facilities plan will be covered out of this account also. Are there any questions on any of these that anybody may have for me? Thank you.
Okay, next up is our Director of Technology, Nick Schmidt.
Good evening, members of the board. My name is Nick Schmidt, Director of Technology, and I'm responsible for the technology budget. This budget covers various technology services and software and hardware for the district. There's no changes from last year. There are a few things that we're going to be watching pretty closely this year would be repairs coming back from, there's a lot of devices that we sent out due to COVID and that we had not anticipated. So we'll be watching the repair costs on those. So far, we've been pretty fortunate, and there haven't been too many, but we'll keep an eye on that. The other item was print costs and copier costs. That I kept that budget item the same. I was hoping that maybe that was going to go down this year. It had actually been looking pretty good, trimesters 1 and 2. But I know we had a lot of printing trimester 3 because of COVID. We sent out a lot of packets. I don't know the final numbers compared to last year yet, but that'll be another thing that we'll be kind of keeping our eye on too. So, but overall, the categories did stay the same. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, Leslie Mueller in food service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Leslie Mueller, Child Nutrition Director. This budget cut covers breakfast and lunch programming, also summer feeding, and then we did add after-school programming this past year. We also are doing more farm-to-school programming, so some costs are covered by that. With all that, we need equipment and food and supplies to support all that programming. And so there we're seeing a level 3 request for any equipment replacements we may need, anticipated food costs that might increase, and the same supplies. Any questions?
This is Director Kimball. I have a question. Are you planning to do a summer lunch program this summer?
We are. We are.
Okay.
It's going to be different. We're going to do the non-congregate like we've been doing. We just got noticed on Friday that we're able to do that, or that's what they want us to do.
Okay.
But we're still kind of planning.
I can call you and ask you some more questions about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, Superintendent Vanderheiden oversees the school board's budget.
Yes, as Becky mentioned, I manage this budget on behalf of the school board. This budget includes school board salaries, associated benefits. It covers our annual legal fees, along with professional development, leadership development, and it also pays for our professional organizations like the Minnesota School Boards Association and Schools for Equity and Education. It also covers expenses with employee recognition and our public relations programs. I would take any questions that you might have. You'll see that the dollar amount is the same. I did move things around. Our fees went up a little bit for the School Board Association and also for Schools for Equity and Education. And I moved some dollars that were underspent in other categories to cover that cost without increasing the total amount.
Okay, with respect to operating capital, here are the outcomes of the administrative team's work session. As you can see, technology continues to be a major theme with respect to how we allocate out these dollars. We do have a very large replacement year with respect to devices coming up in 2021. So we're doing our best to try to spread those costs out over 3 years, moving some of the purchases into the current year and then extending some out into a third year, 2022, so that we could have some alignment with respect to the changing birth to grade 5 facility structure that we have. You can see that 66.5 was allocated to curriculum. We have updates happening within FACS, CTE, music, art, I believe, capital facility. These are some of the projects that Director Moore spoke to with respect to long-term facility maintenance dollars. Here is some complementary funds to help complete those projects. So it is a spend down from our savings account in addition to an incremental $250,000 for the upcoming school year. So that's why you see such a large number in this line item. Equipment and furniture fixtures, we're allocating $67,355. Also included in this line is library books. And the entire team is going to pay close attention to quotes because we're allocating the lowest amount in a very long time to overruns, approximately 1% of the total year's budget of $6,548. So all added up, this is a $2.1 million package. So then if we go to the next slide, that was the last component, as you can tell from your cover sheet. And when we total all of this up, we're totaling a little over 37 million. And just to recap, before we jump into the fund balance projections, all of the revenues is built off of the enrollment projections that we discussed earlier. We apply that expected 18 student loss as we go into next year to the 2% increase in the formula allowance. And then we are going to do our best to match expenses with revenue as we continue to plan and adjust on the next slide to the ongoing public health crisis related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so as you can see on this slide and the next slide, we have a lot of questions that we are asking as an administrative team, as a district. We're trying to figure out a couple of different scenarios so that even with short notice, we can put our plans into action and potentially deliver maybe the where, the how, the when. All of that could look different. It could look similar to what we saw towards the end of this fiscal year. Maybe it'll be a combination approach like we're planning for over the summer. But as we work through the upcoming weeks and summer months, we will be working together to answer these questions. And in addition, on the next slide, we do have some of the answers to Fund 2 food service in that Director Mueller, she does know now that we are able to continue the current federal programming into the summer months, providing meals anyone aged 1 to 18. They'll be serving out of 2 locations likely, and she'll have more marketing information on that out soon. With respect to Fund 4 community education, that one, like Fund 1 general operations, we still have a lot of questions that we're working through. So as I mentioned before, what you've heard tonight is a $37 million package. It's a spending plan. And because of the reasons cited on these last 2 slides, there's likely to be some pretty significant changes as we work through the upcoming months, summer and fall. So then when we roll all of this information up, I'd first like to present a recommended revised budget for the current year. Back in March when we were presenting our best estimates as of Friday, March 13th, which was right before we learned what schools were going to be ordered to do now that the state government had figured out the very beginning of what the pandemic meant for our state. So when I was presenting on March 16th, I was forecasting a modest surplus of approximately $50,000. Now, as we work through these orders and then take a look at those variances that I talked about earlier, where I had the side-by-side and I talked about the budget line items that had gains and losses and how the losses were outpacing the gains, we do see a benefit with respect to higher student enrollment than we were expecting back in March. So while I'm anticipating a modest surplus to the tune of $300,000 for our general fund, the number on the screen includes the capital spend down. So that's why it's different from the number that I'm referencing with respect to the unassigned fund balance, the local funds that are under our control and not restricted for specific purposes by the state. That unanticipated surplus is likely going to be transferred under the direction of the executive order that the governor sent over to the Department of Education in order to make sure that food service and community education aren't left in a deep, deep hole to try to dig out of. Because as you can see with respect to food service and what we knew at the time that this budget went to press on May 12th, we're looking at over $100,000 spend down in this category, because if you recall back on March 16th when we switched our operations within 2 days time to switch to this federal model, all of our local revenue and local funding for food service shut off because there isn't room in this federal model to offer a la carte, fee-based meals, those sorts of things. So we are looking at a projected deficit of $40,000. But what I don't show here, because it would be a balance sheet adjustment at year end, these are all income statement line items. I don't show the transfer from the general fund to food service or to community ed, because again, those aren't expense or revenue type of accounting transactions. As you can see here, we do anticipate a modest spend down within the core community education of $11,000 to an overall fund balance of $245,000. So as we take a look then into next year, as I mentioned before, the $225,000 reduction in expenses that the district identified in April and May of this year, extending into June, those are carried forward into the next year. And so then you can see, including operating capital spend down, I'm projecting a deficit of approximately $2 million. But if you carve out that operating capital spend down, we're looking at a deficit, modest deficit of $500,000. So expenses and revenues aren't going to match perfectly. We are going to roll forward those reduced expenditures into next year. So that is helping that net effect a little bit. This is something that we need to watch and monitor because we need to have revenues and expenditures matching, or that will compound us over time. With respect to food service and community education, I'm expecting a balanced budget. We will keep updating our budget estimates as we learn more about what our programs are going to look like for the duration of the upcoming school year. With respect to the budget revision for current year, I'm just kind of fine-tuning building construction, debt service, trust, health, dental, student activities, all of those accounts at this time. I don't have a lot of significant changes to report. With respect to those same accounts for the upcoming school year's projected position, next June at this time, we do anticipate a building construction spend down of approximately $19 million as we make sure that our construction plans are well underway as we head into next summer. With respect to each year, I do also want to call out that the general fund, as I mentioned, has operating capital spend down, which is planned related to the projects that were discussed earlier. For the current year, that estimate spend down is $614,000, and then for next year, it's $1.5 million. So with that, I do want to, on the next slide, pay some special attention to the unassigned fund balance. Because what I've done here is I've graphed our savings account. the unassigned fund balance, the savings account that is under local control and discretion. The funds that are charted here do not have any sort of restrictions or legislatively set parameters around these funds. These are the funds that we rely on for emergencies for cash flow purposes. What you can see here too is a chart that projects out where we anticipate this balance to go into 2025. Now, of course, in order to do that, we have a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions again can change. But what's factored in right now, as you can see in the title of the chart, enrollment based on grade progression ratios is what's fed into the model. We do anticipate the SPED cross-subsidy increasing by $500,000 a year. That is very conservative. However, we have seen swings of that magnitude in either direction in any given fiscal year. In addition, after this year, for 2021, the budget hearing that we're focusing on right now, I have dialed in a 2% formula increase, but then for 22, 23, 4, and 5, I have 0% on the formula, in line with my best estimates based on economic indicators that we're seeing, which reflect what schools then went through during the Great Recession. Settlements I have dialed in at 2.5% to 3%. And then again, these assumptions are very fluid. But the trend I wanted to point out is that we did spend down our fund balance from $9.7 million to $8.3 million at the end of 2018. Then we have seen some recovery in this fund due to the better than expected enrollment in 2019. So it was better than expected with respect to projections, which was a breath that we were able to take for a year. But better than expected still meant one additional student. That's what that meant relative to the prior year. And now this year with our April Mars submission under consideration, we're looking at a reduction of 55 students for the current year relative to the last year. So the red line then that runs across the chart is the amount of operating expenses that I recommend we have on hand within the savings account to ensure that should the governor decide to use some of these tools, which basically use schools as banks, if they decide to shift our aid or our taxes, we will then have 2 to 3 months of expenses in the savings account. And what that will permit us to do is make sure we can pay our bills, make payroll happen for that period of time while we secure outside financing should we need to do that. So I just wanted to pause there for questions before we wrap up some of the final thoughts with respect to this budget hearing.
This is Joellen Kimball. Becky, are you assuming on this chart that the state of Minnesota is going to borrow money from us? Is that the huge drops?
No, the huge drops. No, this is not a chart of cash flow purposes. Cash flow would show, let's say we typically expect a larger aid payment, say $1.2 million in August. If what they do is they say they're only going to send us 60, 70, or 80% of that, that becomes a cash flow issue, whereby we need to make sure we can float ourselves until that other 20, 30, or 40% shows up. So the drop that you're seeing is the compounding effect of expenses outpacing revenues. So if we see 0% on the formula, which is 80% of our total revenue coming from the state, but we have expenses increasing by 2.5% to 3%, you can see how if we were to do nothing, that variance compounds over time. But as you know, we're not going to do nothing. This is just to show what that future looks like. This is the same picture you'd see in a lot of districts if you were to look out 5 years. However, we have the advantage of having the savings account. Some districts our size have 10% of operating expenditures on hand. That was the average of a peer group that I just looked at not too long ago, I think like 3 weeks ago. My days are kind of running together this school year. But so we do have that advantage in that our bars are resting a little bit higher than where they're sitting. But at the end of the day, that drop is that compounding effect of expenses outpacing revenues into the future.
Becky, this is Keith Camrath. As of today, you're not recommending any reductions in the expense side?
I'm not at this time, Chair Camrath. I think you can tell from this chart that there will likely be expense reductions in the coming years if some of these budget assumptions play out like what they did in the Great Recession. However, at this time, we don't know what our operating model will look like going forward. And until we know what we need, what's our new normal, I don't feel confident in recommending any sort of adjustments. I think our administrative team needs to take the time this summer over the next coming weeks and months to really put together some various scenarios that we could deploy. And then once we, test them, brainstorm together, figure out what's feasible, what can work, what can't work, we'll have a recommendation for the school board regarding what a new operation could look like. And then we can compare the cost of that to what we're currently spending, et cetera, and bring a recommendation back to you.
Well, and as always, the best we can do is, based on what we know to be true today, make our best guess projection. This is a challenging process in a normal year, trying to estimate enrollment and so on. And gosh, there's just so many moving parts to this budget. So, I understand, moving forward, we're going to have to be flexible. So thank you for your professional insight to try and make a best guess at this.
Absolutely.
This is Joellen Kimball again. So way back, one of the first slides, Becky, you showed money that we've had to spend and also that we've lost because of the pandemic. And
Yes.
just as we were going through the budget, I just started a list, and it's just a question I have, like, so we plant operations, we haven't had to heat our buildings as much, electricity, water. We had no state testing this spring. I haven't heard of any summer school opportunities this summer. The transportation costs for special ed, I'm not sure if we're still paying those, like the private nurse when there's no school. I just am wondering, are there more things that should go on that list?
There potentially could be. If you recall, when I put this together and rolled it up, it was May 12th, and then the summer school guidance came out on May 14th. So since that time, so that would have been 4 business days ago, our administrative team has held 2 meetings already in order to plan and try to assess those very variables that you're bringing forward. And so it is likely that we will see reductions in some categories for the next school year. We just have to first take the time to carefully plan what our operation will look like, and then I'll be able to bring back an updated list once we secure that plan.
Thank you.
So then in summary this evening, all of the detailed information that you may want to review ahead of the June meeting is linked through that budget landing page. And then at the very top of the budget landing page that you received a link to is a link to these slides, as well as a detailed set of budget assumptions that I included when I was rolling up the budget in the middle late last week. And so with that, we will hang on the line for additional questions this evening, of course, but then along the way, if something comes to mind and you have a question, please reach out to me, Superintendent Vanderheiden, or any of the administrators that you heard from this evening. And then we will fine-tune our estimates and bring back an updated set of numbers when we present in June. A couple of other things that our assumptions at this time that we're going to continue to review. We've spoke at great length about the COVID-19 pandemic, but in addition, at this time of year, we're running open enrollment for benefits. And so following open enrollment, we'll have a better estimate of our benefit costs. And so we'll make sure that we include that in any revision that we bring forward, as well as continually reviewing and updating our enrollment projections as stated on the next slide. And then we do have 2 large contracts that are unsettled. And so with what with what I knew last week on May 12, 13, 14, when I was rolling this up, I was using board targets. But I do just want to mention again that this is all based on the plan, the spending plan, and that absolutely could change. So with that concludes the formal pieces of the budget hearing, the preliminary budget hearing. And we'll stay in touch as we figure out our operating environment and our operating model as we move into the future. And then with that, we can open it up for questions directed towards myself, Superintendent Vanderheiden, really any member of the administrative team. They've all stayed on the line.
This is Kimball again. Becky, the drop in enrollment that you've seen like since April, is that in any way related to the coronavirus?
We're wondering what long-term implications this will have for families with respect to the type of school they enroll their children in. However, there has been very little drop activity since the pandemic began. This really reflects the smaller cohort sizes moving through the system. It reflects the non-public options that are available in the community, and it also reflects PSEO adoption rates that reflect 2018 and prior. 2019 was a lower year for utilization for PSE programming, and like we expected, that did not continue this year. So really, from what I can tell the last couple of weeks, it's not like we had a sudden drop in enrollment on back of the pandemic. Really what we're seeing is the demographics of our time feeding into our system with respect to smaller family sizes, and then thereby having smaller cohorts making up the majority of our system.
To the other members of the school board, I would just encourage you to ask questions. If you've made notes regarding any questions that you might have that you'd like to discuss offline with any of the directors, please do so sooner rather than later. We really don't have that much time. This meeting was pushed back about a month from what we normally would receive this information. So I would encourage you to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to contact whoever might be able to help you with that, so that when we get to the June meeting, we've got the details pretty well settled and be able to adopt the final budget at that time. So this, again, the final adoption will be at our regular June meeting. Is there anything else, Becky, that we need to cover regarding our budget or anything else this evening?
Oh, thank you for the questions.
Thank you again for your leadership in preparing this. This is a big process. All the people that presented part of their budget this evening were all part of a joint effort in preparing the overall budget. I'm assuming this is at the end of the day, the recommended budget proposal by the entire group, correct?
That is correct. We worked together as a team over many months, several meetings feed up to this night.
There is considerable negotiation between directors when it comes to hammering out the final numbers. Some things will go up, some things will go down, but at the end of the day, everything there is interplay between all of these pieces, and at the end of the day, everything needs to fit into the size box that we're projecting for our final budget. So there are there's a lot of coordination that happens in the process to get to what we just saw this evening. So I'd like to thank all of our directors for their effort with their individual parts of the budget, and to Becky especially for the overall coordination of that. There's nothing further. Are we ready to entertain a motion to adjourn?
This is Director Kimball, so moved.
Motion to adjourn by Director Kimball.
Brian Pullman, second.
And motion seconded by Director Pullman. Any further discussion? If not, we will again vote by roll call vote. I know, is Director Bernard with us? If not, Director Bettenhausen?
Aye.
Director Bettenhausen votes aye. Director Camrath votes aye. Director Kimball?
Aye.
Director Kimball votes aye. Director Pullman?
Aye.
Director Pullman votes aye. And Director Wilkie?
Aye.
Director Wilkie votes aye, and the motion is carried. Thank you all for a good meeting. Again, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to find answers for those questions. Again, thanks for a good meeting.